The air at the Henderson County Equipment Auction hung thick and heavy, a mix of late October dust, cheap coffee, and the faint, greasy perfume of old diesel. It was 1978, and the mood was electric. Land prices had doubled in 5 years, corn was fetching a king's ransom, and the banks were throwing money at any farmer with a pulse and a deed. I stood near the back, leaning against the rusty fender of my Ford F-250, watching the spectacle unfold. My name is Jedadiah Stone, and I was there for a John Deere 24-foot chisel plow, a good heavy one that my old International couldn't quite handle, but my big tractor could. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Bill Sampson, whose voice sounded like gravel in a coffee can, was working the crowd into a frenzy over a slightly used International 1486. The tractor was clean, the paint still glossy red, the tires barely scuffed. It went for a price that made my jaw tighten, a price higher than it sold for new 2 years prior. The man who bought it, a young fellow I didn't recognize, grinned like he'd just won the lottery. He hadn't. He'd just signed his name to a note the size of a small farm, but he didn't know it yet. None of them did. Then he came strutting through the crowd. Richard Davies, Rich as everyone called him, and for good reason. He didn't walk. He paraded, dressed in a clean, new pair of Carhartts that had never seen a grease stain and a seed corn cap perched on his perfectly coiffed hair. He was the poster boy for the new kind of farming. Farming on paper. Farming with the banker's pen. He clapped the young buyer on the back. "Goodbye, son. Can't make money with old junk," he boomed, loud enough for half the county to hear. His eyes flickered over to me, a smirk playing on his lips. He was flanked by his 2 sons, both chips off the old block, already reeking of arrogance and easy credit. I just gave a slow nod, my gaze settling back on the auction. I wasn't there to play games with Rich Davies. My business was my own. I farmed a section and a half of the best black dirt in the county, land my grandfather had broken with a team of mules. Every acre, every machine, every nut and bolt in my shop was paid for. In 1978, that made me a dinosaur, an outcast. The chisel plow came up. It was a good one. Solid frame, the shanks were straight. Bill Sampson started the bidding. I let the tire kickers and the dreamers have their fun, waiting until the price settled into the realm of reason. I raised a hand at $3,000. The bidding stalled. It was a fair price. "Do I hear 3,100? Bill chanted. 3,500. The voice was smug, cutting through the chatter. It was Rich. He hadn't even looked at the plow. He was just looking at me. I held his gaze for a moment. I could see the challenge in his eyes. This wasn't about a piece of tillage equipment. This was about his way versus mine. He'd been buying up land all around me, leveraging every parcel to get the next. His machine shed was a monument to modern debt, filled with brand new John Deere green, 2 8640 articulated 4-wheel drives, a 7800 combine that was so big it looked like it could harvest the whole state, planters that unfolded like giant metal insects, all of it gleaming, all of it owned by the bank. I gave a slight shake of my head to the auctioneer. Not because I didn't have the money. I had it in a passbook savings account at the First National, earning a paltry 5%. But the plow wasn't worth $3,500, not to a man who understood the real meaning of value. Rich chuckled, a loud, obnoxious sound. "See, boys," he said to his sons, "Jedadiah here, he thinks so small. You got to spend money to make money." He swaggered over to the auctioneer's clerk, pulling out a checkbook with a flourish. As he walked past me, he paused. "Still running that old homemade monster, Jed?" he asked, dripping with condescension. "I'm surprised the scrap man hasn't hauled it off yet." He was talking about my tractor, my big bud. an HN 320, built up in Havre, Montana, back in '75. It wasn't homemade, not by a long shot, but it wasn't green or red. So to men like Rich, it didn't count. It was painted a simple, industrial white. The paint faded and chipped. A patch of rust bloomed on the corner of the cab where a branch had scraped it. It was powered by a Cummins NTA 8555 engine, a big inline six that displaced 855 cubic inches of American iron. It put out 320 horsepower, and it made a sound not like a tractor, but like the earth itself clearing its throat. It was a simple, brutally strong machine, and I'd bought it with 3 years of saved profits, paid in cash. It was mine. She still runs, I said quietly. For now, Rich sneered, before turning and leaving, his sons trailing in his wake like pilot fish. I watched him go, the anger a slow, hot burn in my gut. It wasn't just the insult. It was the blindness. He and all the others, they were dancing on a cliff's edge, drunk on cheap loans and government subsidies, convinced the music would never stop. They saw my paid-for equipment, my careful spending, my refusal to take on debt as a sign of failure, a lack of vision. They couldn't understand that a man who sleeps soundly because he owes no one is the richest man in the county. Before I go on and tell you how I found that big bud and what it took to get it home, I have to ask you folks something. It's important to the heart of this story. What was the first tractor you ever learned to drive? Was it an old Farmall H with a hand clutch? A John Deere B that you had to spin the flywheel on? Or maybe a Ford 8N your grandpa let you steer down a laneway? Take a minute and tell me in the comments below. It matters. Those first machines, they teach you more than just how to plow a field. They teach you about patience, about mechanics, and about the value of what you have. The next few years were a strange time. On the surface, Rich Davies was proving himself right. The boom kept booming. Corn hit $3 a bushel and stayed there. Every time you turned around, Rich was buying another 80 acres, tearing out another fence line to make his fields bigger, more efficient for his massive machinery. He bought a brand new 4-wheel drive Steiger Panther, bigger and more powerful than his 2 Deeres combined. The dealer brought it out on a lowboy trailer, and half the township came out to watch them unload it. It was like a parade. Rich stood there, chest puffed out, accepting congratulations like he'd invented farming. He started calling his operation Davies Agribusiness, as if the simple word farm was beneath him. His wife drove a new Lincoln, and he built a new brick house on a hill overlooking his land, our land, the land his granddaddy and mine had worked side by side. Meanwhile, I just kept my head down. I farmed my ground. The big bud pulled my 30-foot cultivator and my old John Deere planter without breaking a sweat. The deep, guttural roar of that Cummins engine was the first thing I heard in the morning and the last thing I heard at night during planting and harvest. It was a sound of security, a sound of ownership. But old iron, no matter how well built, demands its due. One spring afternoon in '79, I was working down a field that had been fall plowed, the soil turning over like black cake. The bud was pulling a 40-foot field cultivator, and the engine was just loping along, the turbo whistling its quiet tune. Suddenly, there was a high-pitched whine from under the cab, followed by a shudder that I felt through the seat of my pants. The steering got heavy, and the cultivator arms, held up by the hydraulics, began to sag. I immediately pushed in the clutch, a heavy, man-sized clutch that took a strong leg, and throttled the big Cummins down to an idle. The whine grew louder, a sick, grinding sound of metal on metal. I knew that sound. It was the sound of a hydraulic pump eating itself alive. A main pump failure on a tractor that size was no small thing. It controlled everything: the steering, the brakes, the three-point hitch, the remote outlets. Without it, I had a 30,000-pound paperweight. I climbed down from the cab, the silence of the field suddenly deafening without the engine's roar. A thin stream of hydraulic fluid, shimmering like blood in the afternoon sun, was dripping from the belly of the beast. I walked back to the shop, a 2-mile walk that gave me plenty of time to think. Rich Davies drove by in his shiny new pickup, the one he bought just for running errands. He slowed down, rolled down his power window, and looked at the big bud sitting silent in the middle of the field. "Having trouble, Jed?" he called out, that familiar smirk on his face. "Just taking a break," I said, not giving him the satisfaction. "Right," he laughed. "If you need a real tractor to finish up, just let me know. I could have one of my deers over here in an hour. Course, I'd have to charge you a fair rate." "I'll manage," I said, turning my back and continuing my walk. His laughter followed me down the road. Back in my shop, I pulled out the service manuals. They were thick as city phone books, the pages stained with grease from my own hands. The pump was a gear-driven, variable displacement piston pump, buried deep in the tractor's transmission housing. It wasn't a job you could do in the field. For the next 3 days, my shop became an operating room. I drained 50 gallons of high guard fluid into clean barrels. I used my engine hoist and a web of chains to support the drive line as I unbolted it. I laid on a creeper under the cold, massive steel frame, my world shrinking to the circle of light from my drop lamp. Bolts the size of my thumb fought me every turn, caked with years of dirt and grime. My knuckles were busted and bleeding, my face streaked with a mix of oil and sweat. Finally, on the second day, I got the pump out. It was heavier than a sack of seed corn, and its guts were chewed to pieces. A single ball bearing had failed, and it had cascaded through the whole assembly, scoring the pistons and warping the swash plate. It was junk. The nearest big bud dealer was in Minnesota. I called them from the party line phone in the kitchen, my wife shushing the kids so I could hear. The parts man was helpful, but the news was grim. A new pump assembly was over $4,000. $4,000. I could buy a decent used Farm All M for that kind of money. "Is there any other way?" I asked, the number sitting like a stone in my stomach. "Well," the parts man said, after a long pause. "The pump itself is a standard Eaton. If you can get the model number off the housing, you might be able to find a rebuild kit or a remanufactured one from a hydraulic supply house. It'll be a lot cheaper. But you'll have to put it together yourself. It's precision work." I spent an hour with a wire brush and a can of brake cleaner, scrubbing the grease off the pump housing until I found the small metal tag. I read the numbers over the phone to a man in Des Moines who sounded like he'd been selling hydraulic parts since the invention of the gear. "Yep, got a rebuild kit for that one," he said. "Gaskets, seals, bearings, new piston set, the works. $420, plus shipping." The relief washed over me so strong I had to sit down on an overturned bucket. "I'll take it," I said. The parts arrived 2 days later. I spent an entire day meticulously cleaning every component, laying them out on a clean workbench in the exact order they appeared in the diagram. I measured tolerances with a micrometer, lubricated every O-ring with fresh hydraulic fluid, and torqued every bolt to spec. It was slow, painstaking work. My sons came out to watch, their eyes wide with a mixture of awe and confusion. They were used to seeing their friends' fathers just call the dealer. By the end of the 3rd day, I had the rebuilt pump installed back in the tractor. I filled it with the filtered fluid, bled the lines, and climbed into the cab. I turned the key. The big Cummins coughed to life, belching a puff of black smoke before settling into its familiar, deep idle. I watched the hydraulic pressure gauge. For a heart-stopping moment, it didn't move. Then, slowly, the needle began to climb up into the green. I engaged the lever for the cultivator, and the big steel arms rose smoothly into the air. I put the tractor in gear and finished the field. The whole ordeal, the breakdown, the diagnosis, the repair, had cost me 3 days of downtime and $450 in parts and shipping. The community, however, only saw the 3 days my tractor sat dead in the field. At the co-op getting seed, the talk was all about Jed Stone's old junk breaking down again. Rich Davies held court by the coffee machine, telling everyone how his new Steiger had GPS, a brand new technology then, and an air-conditioned cab with a radio. "You can't afford downtime in this business," he declared to his audience of nodding heads. "That's why you gotta run new. Pay the man, get the warranty, and keep rolling." They all looked at me, this relic from another time, with my grease-stained hands and my patched-up monster. They looked at me with a kind of pity. They didn't see the $4,000 I'd saved. They didn't see the knowledge I'd gained, the deeper connection I'd forged with my machine. They just saw a man who was falling behind, a man who was too stubborn or too poor to join the modern world. The good times kept rolling into 1980. The papers called it a golden age for the American farmer. Land that my father had bought for $200 an acre was now being appraised at $2,000. It felt unreal, like a fever dream. The bankers were the high priests of this new religion, and their gospel was leverage. "Use the equity in your land," they'd say, sliding loan applications across their polished desks. "It's not making you any money just sitting there." Rich Davies was their most devout follower. He bought another quarter section that bordered my north field, paying a price that made the whole county gasp. To celebrate, he traded in his 2-year-old John Deere 8640s for 2 brand-new 88 450s. They were the biggest tractors Deere had ever made, twin giants with V8 engines and 8 massive tires. The day they were delivered, it looked like an invasion. He had them parked at the end of his lane so anyone driving by could see them. They sat there gleaming, monuments to his success, symbols of his faith in an ever-expanding future. His operation was a marvel of modern efficiency, I had to admit. He had a brand-new grain leg and drying system, so he didn't have to wait in line at the elevator. He had a fleet of new grain trucks to haul his crop. He hired 2 full-time men to help him run it all. On paper, Davies' agribusiness was a spectacular success, a multi-million-dollar enterprise. My operation, by contrast, looked stagnant. I hadn't bought any land. My machine shed was the same one my father had built in 1950. The big bud was now 5 years old, and it looked it. The paint was more faded, the dents and scratches telling the story of 5 hard seasons. I did buy a newer combine, a used International 1460, but I paid cash for it with the profits from 2 good harvests. To my neighbors, it was another sign that I was being left in the dust. Rich had a brand-new 7720 with a corn head that could swallow 8 rows at a time. My 1460 could only handle 6. It was hard, I won't lie. It was hard to go to the diner for coffee and hear the whispers. Hard to see the looks of pity from men I'd known my whole life. It was hardest on my wife, who had to endure the ladies at church talking about the Davies' new swimming pool and their vacation to Hawaii. It was hard on my sons, who had to listen to Rich's boys brag about their new 3-wheelers and their fancy new trucks. "Dad," my oldest Michael asked me one night at the dinner table, "why don't we get a new tractor? The Davies have 3 new ones." I put down my fork and looked at him. He was 16, a good boy, a hard worker. But he was a child of his time. He saw the shine, not the rust underneath. "Michael," I said, my voice quiet but firm, "the Davies don't own those tractors. The bank does. Mr. Davies has to sell his first 10,000 bushels of corn just to make the interest payment on those machines, every single year. Before he buys a single bag of seed or pays a single electric bill, we don't have those payments. Every bushel we sell, after our costs, is ours. That tractor out in the shed, that combine, this house, this land, it's all ours. There's a difference." He didn't fully understand. I could see it in his eyes. How could he? All he saw was us working with old equipment while our neighbors lived like kings. The world was telling him that debt was progress, that my way was the way of the past. That fall, I was in town at the bank, making a deposit. The bank president, Mr. Harrison, a man whose father had given my father his first loan, called me into his office. He was a nervous man, always fidgeting with his tie. "Jedadiah," he said, offering me a seat. "I was just looking over your accounts. Strong year. Very strong." "The weather cooperated," I said. "It sure did," he nodded, shuffling some papers on his desk. "Jed, I have to be honest. The board and we look at your operation, and we see so much untapped potential. Your debt-to-asset ratio is basically zero. You have hundreds of thousands of dollars in equity just sitting there. You could easily expand. Buy that Henderson quarter that's coming up for sale. We could put together a financing package for you that would let you upgrade your entire equipment line." He was trying to sell me. He was trying to get me to be more like Rich Davies. I was a missed opportunity for him, a column of potential loan interest left uncollected. "I'm happy with where I'm at, Bill," I told him. He sighed, leaning forward. "Look, Jed, I know you're conservative. Your father was the same way. But times have changed. With inflation running the way it is, this money you have in savings is losing value every day. The smart play is to convert that cash into hard assets. Land, iron, they're not making any more of it." It was the siren song of the era, the logic that seemed so inescapable. And for a moment, I felt a flicker of doubt. Was I a fool? Was I being too cautious, letting the opportunity of a lifetime pass me by out of simple stubbornness? Then I glanced out his window, across the town square. Rich Davies was just getting into his new Lincoln. He looked stressed, his face tight as he headed into the post office. I wondered if he was picking up a notice from the bank. I turned back to Mr. Harrison. "Thanks for the advice, Bill, but I think I'll sleep on it." As I left the bank, I felt a chill in the air that had nothing to do with the November wind. On the radio in my truck on the way home, the news was on. A man named Paul Volcker, the new chairman of the Federal Reserve, was on the radio. He was talking in a dry, academic voice about combating inflation and monetary restraint. He used phrases like tightening the money supply and painful but necessary adjustments. It was just background noise to most people, the kind of government talk that farmers usually ignored. But I listened, and a cold knot of dread began to form in the pit of my stomach. That night, a letter came in the mail. It was from the company that financed our family's one small debt, the loan on my wife's station wagon. It was a form letter, full of legal jargon, but one line stood out. It was about our loan, which we had assumed was at a fixed rate. It spoke of a clause in the fine print, a clause I'd never paid attention to. It said the lender reserved the right to adjust the interest rate in accordance with prevailing market conditions. Our rate, the letter informed us, would be climbing from 9% to 12%. It was the first tremor, the first sign that the ground beneath our feet was about to give way. The first sign of the shift was subtle, a change in the quality of the light. The spring of 1981 came in dry and stayed that way. The sky took on a hazy, bleached-out look, and the winds that blew across the flatlands carried more dust than promise. By June, the corn, which should have been shoulder-high and deep green, was stunted and pale, the leaves curling in on themselves by midday, a desperate prayer for a rain that never came. The ground, our rich black dirt, turned the color of ash and cracked open in patterns that looked like a dry riverbed. It was a flash drought, fierce and sudden. It stressed the crops, and it stressed the men who grew them. At the co-op, the usual morning banter was replaced by hushed conversations and long, worried stares at the brass-colored sky. The price of corn, which had been the foundation of everyone's prosperity, began to soften. A grain embargo against the Soviet Union, a political move made in a city 1,000 miles away, had slammed the door on a major market. The price slid from $3.50 a bushel to $3, then $2.80. Every 10-cent drop was like a body blow to a man leveraged to the hilt. Rich Davies started to look frayed around the edges. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by a tense, hurried energy. I saw him one afternoon at the parts store, his face grim. One of his new John Deere 8850s was down. I heard him telling the parts man about it, his voice tight with frustration. It wasn't a simple mechanical failure. The transmission, a complex quad range with its own set of hydraulic clutches and electronic sensors, refused to shift out of park. "The light on the dash is just blinking," Rich said, running a hand through his perfect hair, messing it up for the first time I'd ever seen. "We've checked the fluid, checked the fuses. It's just dead." The parts man shook his head. "That's a call to the dealer, Rich. You need a technician with the diagnostic kit. Sounds like a solenoid pack or the control module. You can't fix that with a wrench." Rich swore under his breath. The dealer was 70 miles away, and their top technicians were booked solid for 2 weeks. Every day that tractor sat was a day he was falling behind, burning fuel in his other machines to try and keep up. The bill, when it finally came, would be astronomical. A service call fee, mileage, and a labor rate that made a doctor's visit look cheap, not to mention the cost of the proprietary electronic parts. My big bud just kept running. The old Cummins didn't have a single wire going to a computer. Its transmission was 10 forward speeds of hardened steel gears that you shifted with a simple lever. It didn't know about the drought or the embargo. It just knew how to pull. During that dry spell, I parked the big chisel plow and pulled out my old V-ripper, a heavy, brutal tool designed to shatter hardpan. I ran it deep, 12 inches down, between the corn rows, breaking up the compacted soil to help what little moisture there was get to the roots. It was slow, hard work, and the bud grunted and smoked, the turbo screaming under the strain. But it got the job done. Rich and his hired men, with their wider, faster equipment, couldn't do that. Their cultivators would just skate over the baked earth. The cracks in Rich's empire began to show in small ways. The new Lincoln his wife drove was quietly traded for a more sensible Ford sedan. One of his 2 hired men was let go. He claimed it was because he was so efficient, now he only needed 1. Nobody believed him. Then, the for sale sign went up on the family's lake cabin, the one his sons always bragged about. At the diner, the talk was that Rich was getting a little cash flow tight. It was the polite way of saying the man was drowning. The real tidal wave hit that winter. Paul Volcker and the Federal Reserve, in their war against inflation, cranked up the interest rates until the whole country screamed. The prime rate the rate banks charge their best customers, hit an unbelievable 21.5%. For farmers with variable rate loans from the Production Credit Association, it was a death sentence. Their operating notes, the money they borrowed each spring for seed and fertilizer, were suddenly subject to interest rates that were impossible to pay. Loans that were manageable at 9% became crushing burdens at 18, then 20, then 22. It was like the rules of the world had been rewritten overnight. The very thing that had made them rich, the easy credit, the borrowed money, was now the anchor that was pulling them under. The land itself, the ultimate security, turned traitor. As farmers began to default, the banks started foreclosing, and a flood of land hit the market. The price collapsed. That $2,000 an acre ground was suddenly worth $1,200, then $1,000, then $800. Men who thought they were millionaires on paper woke up to discover they were bankrupt. Their equity, the foundation of their entire financial lives, had vanished into thin air. The winter of 1982 was the quietest I can ever remember. There was no talk of new equipment, no plans for expansion. There was only the grim, quiet calculus of survival. The phone in our kitchen would ring late at night, and it would be a neighbor, his voice thick with shame, asking if I could spare a few $100s to make a payment, just to hold the bank off for another month. My wife and I helped where we could, quietly, without judgment. We had the money, sitting in that passbook savings account that everyone had called a fool's investment. It wasn't earning much interest, but it wasn't supposed to. Its job was to be there when the storm came. And the storm was here. Rich Davies held on longer than most. He was bigger, so he had farther to fall. He sold off one of the 8850s at a staggering loss, just to raise operating capital for the next spring. He sold his new grain trucks and went back to hiring the co-op to haul his corn. He and his one remaining hired man and his 2 sons worked from sunup to sundown, their faces etched with a permanent, haunted exhaustion. The arrogance was gone, burned away by fear. I saw him at the elevator one day in the fall of '83. We were both waiting to unload. The price of corn was hovering just over $2 a bushel. He looked 10 years older than he had at that auction 5 years before. His clothes were worn, his hands were calloused and stained, no longer the hands of a manager, but the hands of a desperate laborer. He stood by his truck, not looking at anyone. "Rich," I said, walking over. He flinched, then looked up. His eyes were hollow. "Jedadiah," he mumbled. "Tough year," I said, for lack of anything better. A sound came out of him, a harsh, bitter laugh. "Tough year," he repeated. "The bank called my main note yesterday. They gave me 90 days to restructure." You know what that means. I knew. It meant sell everything you can, and what you can't sell, we'll take. "I'm sorry to hear that, Rich," I said. And I meant it. There was no victory in this, no satisfaction. Seeing him broken like this just felt like a tragedy for the whole community. "You tried to tell me," he said, his voice barely a whisper, his gaze fixed on the toes of his worn-out boots. "All of you old-timers, my dad, you all tried to tell me. Debt is a wolf you keep on a leash until the day it gets hungry enough to eat you. I thought you were all fools, stuck in the past." He finally looked at me, his eyes swimming with a terrible clarity. "Turns out I was the fool all along." He turned and walked away before I could say anything else. I watched him go, a man who had flown too close to the sun, his wings of borrowed money melted away, leaving him to fall back to an earth that was no longer his. The following spring, the auction bills went up all over the county. They were printed on cheap, colored paper and stapled to telephone poles. "Public auction. The big letters read, "Due to foreclosure, the assets of Davies Agribusiness will be sold to the highest bidder." The date was set for a Saturday in April. The day of the Davies auction was cold and grey, a hard wind snapping at the flags on the auctioneer's truck. It felt more like a funeral than a sale. The whole county was there, but not in the festive mood of the auctions from a few years back. They were quiet, somber, their faces full of a grim understanding. There but for the grace of God go I. The machinery was lined up in neat rows in the farmyard, the same yard where Rich had hosted parties and shown off his new purchases. The gleaming John Deeres, the massive Steiger Panther, the fleet of implements. They looked like dinosaurs waiting for extinction. They were no longer symbols of prosperity. They were monuments to a broken dream, caked with the mud of the last desperate harvest. Rich was there, standing off to the side with his wife and sons. He looked like a ghost on his own land. His face was a pale, emotionless mask, but his wife was weeping silently into a handkerchief. His sons, who had once been so full of youthful arrogance, stood with their shoulders slumped, their eyes downcast, avoiding the gazes of their former friends. Mr. Harrison, the banker, was there too, looking uncomfortable in his city suit, directing the auctioneers with curt, unhappy gestures. I hadn't come to buy. I didn't need anything. I came to bear witness, to pay my respects in a strange way. I stood near the back, just as I had all those years ago, leaning against the fender of my old Ford. The auctioneer started with the small items, tools from the shop, fuel tanks, spare tires. The bidding was sluggish. No one had any money. Then they moved to the big-ticket items. The Steiger Panther, which Rich had paid over $150,000 for, sold for $40,000 to a large corporate farm from out of state. His last John Deere 8850, barely used, went for less than a third of its original price. It was a bloodbath. Each fall of the auctioneer's gavel felt like a nail being hammered into a coffin. Then they came to his planter, a John Deere 7000, 16 rows, with all the newest attachments for liquid fertilizer and insecticide. It was a good planter, well maintained. A man needs a planter. Without it, you can't even begin to put a crop in. The bidding started low and crawled upwards. It stalled at $8,000. Rich visibly tensed. He needed it to bring more. He was hoping to rent some ground, to do some custom work, to salvage something from the wreckage. But the well was dry. No one had the cash. $8,000, do I hear 81? The auctioneer chanted, his voice losing its usual rhythm. I looked at Rich. I saw the last flicker of hope dying in his eyes, and in that moment, I knew what I had to do. I raised a hand. 10,000, I said, my voice clear and steady in the quiet crowd. A murmur went through the people. All heads turned to me. Mr. Harrison, the banker, looked relieved. Rich looked up, his expression a mixture of shock and utter confusion. The auctioneer, seizing the moment, quickly called for another bid. There was none. "Sold!" he cried, pointing at me. "For $10,000 to Jedadiah Stone." I walked to the clerk's trailer, wrote out a check from my savings account, and got the bill of sale. Then I walked over to where Rich was standing. He wouldn't meet my eye. "Rich," I said quietly. He just shook his head. "I don't need another planter," I said. "Mine works just fine. This one, I'd like you to keep it here. Use it. You're going to be farming that 80 acres your dad left you, aren't you?" It was the small parcel of land that was in his wife's name, the only thing the bank couldn't touch. He finally looked at me, his eyes filled with a pain so deep it was hard to look at. "I can't pay you, Jed. I've got nothing." "I'm not asking you to," I said. Pay me $1 a year lease, so it's all legal. That's all. A man's got to have tools to work with. Your dad helped my dad out with a team of horses during the Depression. Neighbors help neighbors. That's how it's supposed to be." He stared at me for a long moment, his throat working. He tried to speak, but no words came out. He just nodded, a single, sharp nod of acceptance. It was more than an acceptance of the planter. It was an acceptance of his new reality, and of a kindness he never expected from the man he had once mocked so mercilessly. Later that day, when the crowd had thinned and only the scavengers were left, the bank auctioned off the land. The home quarter, the one with the big new brick house on the hill, sold first. Then they put up the quarter section that bordered my north field, the one Rich had bought at the peak of the boom for a king's ransom. The bidding was anemic. I bought it. I paid the bank $700 an acre, a fair price for the time, cash on the barrel. It was less than a third of what Rich had paid for it. The next morning, I drove my truck over to the small house Rich was now renting in town. I found him in the driveway, staring at nothing. "I bought that north quarter," I told him, getting right to the point. His shoulders sagged. "I figured someone would. Guess you got the last laugh, Jed." "This isn't about laughing," I said. "I need a good man to farm it. I'll provide the land, the seed, the fertilizer. You provide the labor and the machinery. That new planter of yours. We'll split the profit, 50-50. It's good ground. You know it better than anyone." He looked at me, dumbfounded. He was being offered a chance, not just to work, but to work his own land again, to feel that dirt under his boots. He was being offered a path back to dignity. "Why?" he asked, his voice cracking. "After everything I said, everything I did. Because this whole thing, this crisis, it wasn't just about you, Rich. It could have been any of us. You just drew the short straw. And because my grandfather taught me that the land remembers. It doesn't care who holds the deed. It only cares about the hands that tend it. And you've always been a good farmer, just not a very good banker." A slow smile touched his lips, the first I'd seen in years. It wasn't the old smug smile. It was something new, something humble. "I can't argue with that," he said. "The years that followed were lean, but they were good. The farm economy slowly healed. Rich and I farmed that quarter section together, and he farmed his own 80. He never got big again. He never wanted to. He learned the quiet satisfaction of a paid-for piece of equipment and a good night's sleep. We became friends, a friendship forged not in prosperity, but in the shared soil of adversity. The community changed, too. The flash and swagger of the 70s were gone, replaced by a more sober, cautious approach. Men started fixing their old machinery again. They talked about cash flow and input costs instead of land speculation. They started looking at me not as a relic, but as a survivor, a man who had seen the storm coming and had built his house on a rock. My son, Michael, came home from agricultural college in '89. He had a head full of new ideas about soil science and genetics, but he also had a deep respect for the lessons of the past. One evening, we were out in the shop, working on the big bud. It was 14 years old now. The paint almost completely faded, but the big Cummins engine still fired up on the first try. We were changing the oil, a messy, familiar ritual. "You know, Dad," he said, wiping his greasy hands on a rag, "I wrote a paper about the farm crisis for one of my economics classes, about debt-to-asset ratios and leveraging." "Did you get a good grade?" I asked, tightening the drain plug. "I did," he said, "but the professor said my main case study, an anonymous farmer who refused to take on debt and survived, was an outlier and not a scalable model for modern agriculture. I chuckled, a deep, rumbling sound. He might be right about that. It's not a model for getting big. It's a model for staying. I handed him the funnel. Pour in the new oil, 15 gallons. As he carefully poured the clean amber fluid into the heart of the great machine, he looked at me. I get it now, Dad. What you were trying to teach me all those years ago. It wasn't about being poor. It was about being free. I put a hand on his shoulder, my gaze drifting across the machine, across the shop filled with tools that were all paid for, and out the open door toward the fields that were ours, free and clear, all the way to the horizon. The setting sun cast a warm, golden light on the old tractor's faded white paint. "That's right, son," I said. "That's exactly right." The deep, guttural roar of that Cummins engine when we fired it up a few minutes later was more than just the sound of a tractor. It was the sound of a legacy. It was the sound of a lesson learned and a future secured, a steady rhythm of iron and oil and wisdom echoing out across the quiet heartland.